Welcome to Draw Process. I'm Ike. I'm going to draw page 55 of episode 2 of my comic First Sun and Sword, and I'll share that process about my development. Here we go. In page 55 of the second episode. Remember, I'm doing no thumbnails, only these roughs from a loose script. This big lizard man had just jumped down on top of the boy, Sun is his name, and he's running away. And so I'm thinking how to show that. So I have the lizard man grabbing him, but he ends up only getting a hold of the big grass cloak he was wearing. So that bulk allowed Sun to escape, and this causes the lizard man to rage and rip it apart. So we just have two panels here, side by side. Action, reaction. He grabs at the Sun, misses, and then rips it apart angrily. And I'm trying to draw hints here that he's getting very tired. He's been running a long time. He's very large and muscular. Even though he's a lizard, they're limited to and how long they can run. So I'm trying to drop those hints as we go. I'm working out my perspective on the scene here. And having the lizard man huff and puff since he's getting tired here. And now, a nice large panel, full width. And we have Farah running, pulling the cart, and she's tossing off her grass cape, cloak. She doesn't need that anymore, it's just slowing her down. Sword is sitting in the cart, holding on. And the men have stepped away. They're quite in shock because of this large lizard man. So their initial goal of capturing them is totally out the window. They're in shock, and they definitely don't want to get killed because the lizard men are hard to predict. Pretty dynamic, exaggerated perspective on this shot because I wanted to capture as much as possible in one shot. And remember, this is a very narrow alleyway, so I've got to have a very extreme kind of perspective on this to capture everything. So I didn't want Pompadour with his hands cut off. I wanted to show him this is the last time we're going to see him. So I wanted you to get a nice payoff of him like, oh God, my hands. But the camera needed to be positioned kind of here for him to stay out of the way of Farah, Sword, and the boy. So you'll notice that when I laid out the panel, I started with Farah and Sword and the boy in the middle of the panel. They're the important thing I want you to easily spot. And her word balloon will guide you right in from the panel above to them in the center. And from there, you could go down and see Pompadour in the bottom corner, leading you towards this next panel that'll be on the bottom left. But I started with them and where I needed them positioned, and then I built out some other figures, built out the perspective, and found the camera angle, found what will work to show everything I needed to show with nothing overlapping where I don't want it to. I made it look easy, let's say, but that is not easy to do when you think about the narrowness of the space and then having figures on both sides of them and the lizard man behind them. It is really hard to capture all of that. So you'll see how I chose to do that with a vanishing point that's within the shot, but it's more like a 2-point perspective, really. I'm starting to implement more dynamic panel shapes. You'll see how this helps them flow. If I had done 4 panels of equal width just across this bottom row here, that would be a little boring, especially in this dynamic moment. So I'm learning to let my panel borders go along with the art. Now, I'm kind of glad that I've restricted myself from doing that in the past, because with less experience, you want to be careful about that. If you're letting yourself do any panel shape that you want, then you run into mistakes like drawing, let's say drawing badly and then making the panel fit that. For example, needing to do an establishing shot, so you do a large sized panel. Drawing something with a poor composition, so you just like expand the panel border to catch it, if that makes sense. You might make those mistakes if you're newer, so you might want to give yourself a more rigid grid or structure to stick to. My biggest experiment with that was when I was drawing a scene from, when was that? 2019 maybe. 13 pages, I think, a scene from The Fifth Element. I just would pause the movie and draw it out into a comic page, and did that every now and then for the year. And that's really all the comics I completed that year. It was a tough year, a different year for me. But I was doing that, and I made it very fun. I let the panel shapes mimic some of the butterfly wing strange shapes and so on that are going on with the environment, the background. And because it was just for fun. That was probably when I did the most of that, and then I have shied away from it since then. I haven't done much of it in this series for the 2 years that I've been making this. But I'm doing more and more of it as I do these roughs. I'm allowing myself to. Part of that is I want to squeeze more panels in. And I want to make sure that the eye can easily flow. So I'll comment on the choices I make with those panel borders as I do them in the upcoming pages, because I've already done the roughs for the whole book now. But when the opportunity comes up, I'll make sure to share that with you. Kind of why I made the decisions that I did with that. Here, for example, it's action, reaction. Makes sense to just do two same-sized panels. They're the same amount of time each. It makes sense. This was a day that I really had to myself, apart from a meeting and another thing I had to do. And I am allowing myself to jump between tasks with what feels good to do. I was feeling, tired. I sit down and I color a page, or I piece together this video. But then I had eaten and I was having a little indigestion, and I was like, okay, I'm going to pencil a page instead of do this video. And then I'll give myself a chance to rest my stomach, and so that I'm not like burping on the video. And so I penciled a page in 45 minutes and came back to do the voiceover. So kind of following what energy I have throughout the day. I'm finding that's helpful. And I do that anyways, if I have some time to get some work done, I assess for myself what energy I have. Can I sit down and focus on penciling a page, or just inking, or coloring, or setting up a video? With the voiceovers, it's a particular kind of energy I need. I need to be able to think clearly and calmly, because I do these, I improvise these. Hopefully you can see here how these rough pencils are getting filled out a little more with this second round of penciling. And it still is really rough and loose, but I'm adding in more. Really trying to focus on story first. They don't have to look beautiful and great. I just need clear story, just enough detail for that to work. And this is enough, even as is, that you can tell what's happening. Someone could enjoy reading this even at this level of messiness. So, and then when I add color and ink, it's obviously going to get a little cleaner. And I let her cloak, her straw cloak, get the way she's tossing it is blocking the view of the men behind her so that their silhouettes, their figures, do not interfere with her figure or sun there, because there would be overlap perhaps. And I don't have to draw them. So I just let her toss that in such a way that it blocks our view of them mostly. But I needed them to be there because I already drew them in the scene. So they'd moved that direction. I've got to put them there, but I can hide them by choosing this scenario. There's a little stream of sewage or runoff running through this alley, and it's not really prominent. The color's very similar to the ground once you see it in color, but it allows for me to put some lines on the ground that follow a direction, and that I can use that to make a direction more pronounced, a line, and to allow them to splash the water. So elements that you can add like that, like I put straw in this scene, which is getting tossed into the air, and some water on the ground. These little elements will give you some things to play with. Even the fact that she has a straw cloak that she can toss off was something I put into the scene to play with later, because I am kind of writing it as I'm going. I'm definitely doing a lot more complicated camera angles and poses than I used to do. And you'll see that here. My mind's eye has him standing in that way. I've got his sword coming up in the foreground, some foreshortening on the arm, and the sword and his head and his body there kind of make a V, really shape around that word balloon there. And because, it's somewhat balanced, but it's definitely weighted to the right. And each panel, I'm taking advantage of the shape. So here, the panel shapes are varied. They're at an angle, but each one is angled, and it's a little more angled than the last. Or actually, that first one might be straight vertical, but each one angles a little more than the last. So they're not necessarily coming from the same point, like in perspective, but there's definitely a ratio. You get the sense of a relationship of the angle from one angled border to the other. Because of that, they are grouped together in your mind. You're picking up on a relationship between the panels, not only because they're on the same tier, the same row, but because of the way that I've angled that. This angle was chosen organically, and the drawings are done organically because I'm really trying to get loose and relaxed here. This angle is so that it definitely needs to be wider up by his eyes. It can get more narrow. We can crop off part of his head, his ear and his jaw, but we need the eyes. So I knew this shape would work. And you'll see, I'm just throwing in the background quickly, finding my kind of horizon line, which was close to eye level. And because of the foreshortening on the arm, I knew the vanishing point would be close to him. I'm just kind of imagining what would that background look like at this angle as I throw it in there. Now, this angle is definitely tilted. The camera's very sideways here, because I knew that with this very narrow shape, especially towards its base at the bottom, it's narrow. I wanted you to see enough of sword to know it's him, right? You can't see his face, but see some of him, and then see Farah behind him, and she is much smaller. And you'll see I'm struggling with his head here because I didn't really work out the angle, the perspective, very well. So as I'm drawing his head, and I put a little bit of structure lines down, as I was drawing his head, I was trying to figure out, wait a minute, like, where's the horizon line again? Because everything's tilted. So that was part of why I struggled with it. Also, because I'm not an expert, and I still get better every time at drawing these figures from all these different angles and everything. But you'll see, I even squeezed in Son's head, just enough of his face in the bottom left corner. So I've really been able to capture all three of them in this panel. And you would, again, what I was saying about these panel shapes and kind of getting better and being more bold with those choices, that is a very narrow panel, strange shape. Somehow I was able to capture all three figures in space. Like, I'm not, they're still existing in space in relationship to each other the same, but I can make them fit anything, which you can do when you use perspective, when you move the camera anywhere. And when you get more confident with your figures, like, I can draw just a little bit of a head, or there's a little bit of his back and shoulders here, but it's enough that I trust that you will know what you're looking at. And that's the confidence of having drawn more. I used to not have that confidence. I wasn't as good at, drawing just a few pieces of the back or the hand or whatever, and trusting that you can see what that is unless I show the whole thing. So I'm getting much more confident in where I can crop things off. I still am trying not to do it in awkward places where it looks like a floating head or something. But still. Word balloon placement, I'm definitely trying to get better at that too. That just the same way that I can try to squeeze these figures in to the panels in whatever shape I want, I'm trying to also make sure I squeeze in the word balloons. And they function a lot like a head. If you think about it, like, you tend to look at people's faces, their eyes, their mouth, when they're talking. And it's one of the first things you see when you look at art. So I really have these oval heads that you might go from one head to the other to the other. That might actually be what your eye does when you flow through my page looking at it. But you're also going to be drawn to the word balloons. That's very natural to do too. So I'm kind of thinking of, the heads and the word balloons as the main points, almost like those drawings that are just dots with numbers, and you kind of put a line in between them. You just draw the lines following the numbers, and then you get a finished line art in the end. The dots, the points that you're connecting, are going to be the heads and the word balloons. That's an oversimplification, but it's something that I feel I pay attention to, is the positioning of the word balloons in relation to the figures or the heads. If the heads are too small, then it's the whole figure functioning as a head in terms of where you're going to look. And so here you'll see in that third panel, the middle one, there's a word balloon at the top, and it's towards the right, because you're going to be reading that top right panel first and then going there. So it's right below that panel that you were on. So you're going to go there immediately. And then the next word balloon is close to the bottom left panel, because that's where you're going to go next. And the figures are in between the two word balloons. I learned a term today that the parallel lines thrown into backgrounds to add texture or gradient is that can be called hay, which, and we have straw or hay in this scene, so that's kind of funny. But I'm definitely using that. That is not simply there to add texture. That is the shadow. You'll notice in the very top left corner, none of that's there. That is where the light is hitting. This is the cast shadow from the building next to them. The building on the left or on their right that you can't see in this shot is casting a shadow onto this spot. I'm getting more comfortable with broken lines and loose and unfinished pieces of things. So there's a window behind the words huff huff. There's a hay. There's the hatching lines behind the words too. And you'll notice the figures back there. It's just open negative space around them, just open white space around them. But enough of the figures there to see. That's probably the first thing you might look at coming to this panel. I don't know. Some people might follow a more linear trajectory of their eye. I think I jump from panel to panel. But whatever the case is, they're positioned just behind his hand. I was happy to that's another thing about getting confident now, is I'm happy to let his arm and hand cover up much of the figures and show just enough. And I can draw them very small, but know that there's just enough for you to see what they are, especially once I color them. Now, with this straw, I'm not fully indicating the outline of it because it's kind of just like a cloud in a way. So I'm not worried about a complete outline on all of it. That's another thing that it has to do with this more loose way that I'm trying to complete and do the line art. Trying not to take things literally, but rather more impressionistically. We don't have to outline everything. There's enough of these lines around the hay for you to understand what that is. And then with color, I'll definitely, be able to show you that. When you draw really small, you'll see this lizard man here. I really broke him up into basic body segments. You got the shoulder, the bicep area, the lower arm, the chest. Everything's in a chunk, rounded organic chunks that are connected together. It gets really basic when it's really small. And I do that. There's something to being able to draw when your small figures that have to be abstracted more look like your big figures. I feel like that is a good thing. That's something that's nice. And so, I could draw a figure that small and then draw the figure large and just see like, okay, is the quality similar? And sometimes it's harder to draw them really small, to abstract it to that degree. But going with more rounded shapes and more prominent basic body shapes and segments, like the shoulder and the chest, does make it easier to break it down when it's small, and maybe to make it easier on yourself when it's large on the page. I know that I need to continue to improve my anatomy, but what I have learned, especially since starting this actually over the last 2 years, what I've picked up from my little bit of studying here and there has made a difference. I'm not simply capturing muscle groups, but they're pressing and tightening, against each other, like the way his arm is behind his back and it's kind of pressing his shoulder blade muscles. I forget what those are called, with his tricep, and the way the traps are kind of pushed over. That's something I'm doing more of, and it definitely it's something I want to move in that direction. It has to do with conveying what's actually there and making things feel alive. If I didn't even inaccurately, but if I didn't convey the muscles of the figure and if I just knew basic forms, it would be hard to convey that action, that aliveness, that strain of the muscles and so on. I want my figures to really look alive. I want everything to feel organic, raw. And it makes it feel like it's in motion. And that's another reason that I'm glad I've moved towards rounder shapes instead of a little more geometric. With the straighter lined, simpler, anatomy, simpler puppets that you're using. In some comics, when I see that, they've done well by making the figures rubbery, in extreme perspective, or exaggerated like poses, like almost like where it seems like their whole body is the punch and it's just happened all at once. They've turned into an arrow. That works with when you go more geometric, but with my style having a lot of action, but it doesn't feel like that. It's not like everyone has to go into super speed or super cartoon for you to feel the impact. I can capture that sense of impact and by creating organic shapes that are straining, that are alive, that are they're doing a function, they're doing something. And so I want to continue to learn that and get better at it, so that I can do it even faster, even more naturally. And so that's something I see. That's my future here. What's around the corner for me, to continue to put a little time in. It doesn't have to be a ton, but a little time on anatomy, and so that I get even better at this, so that it's even more alive, not just more accurate. It doesn't have to be accurate even, but I need it to be more alive. And for me, it's going to move in the direction of what I see. That's another thing, is what I see in my mind's eye. I see real people doing this. I don't see Disney-looking characters or something doing it. So I don't want to abstract too much from a realistic figure. It's a movie to me. So my style tends towards more realistic. Not compared to some, of course, but it's not some kind of cartoony style, stylized bodies with extremely distorted, ratios of, torso and heads to hips and everything, like you might see in a cartoon. And doing some really stylized figures it would be a path that I could take that would be different than this one. But like I said, this is the path for me. And when I get those structures, those organic shapes, pretty solid in the muscles and so on, or I understand them well. I don't necessarily draw all of them, but it helps me also with light and shadow, with form. Knowing where to place shadows that will work is not as hard as it used to be, because it's pretty straightforward. Whether that's a hard shadow where there's like a light edge on someone and the rest is in shadow and you got to match that to the form, or if I'm just adding some feathering like you see here. A lot of this is just shading that helps add form. And you'll see there, yep, there it is. Very dynamic, very moving, like there's a lot of movement to the figures and everything. And that's the finished page. There's actually two passes of shadow. Each one's a little different. Just in a few spots, I might add an extra little bit of shadow, and then the one lighting layer to add highlights onto things, help things pop. I'm learning to use less of that. I can see in my earlier pages, I would just highlight everything the light touches. And now I'm just highlighting the most important, focus points a little bit. Definitely. And then I'm 2 pages ahead of this one, and then I'm doing even more of it as we go. So the most important thing being, the main focus of the figures, the items, whatever is the main thing I want you to look at. I'm going to brighten that up and add highlights on it and try not to just put it everywhere. And we are getting into the final scene. You might call it, I guess, 2 scenes, because there's a little bit of a lull, and then things pick back up. In the last 30 something pages. That's it for this week. Thank you for joining me on the journey. I'll be back.